The small town of Maplewood prided itself on its idyllic charm and close-knit community. It was a place where neighbors exchanged smiles and waves, children rode their bikes without fear, and the local bakery knew everyone's favorite pastries. Yet beneath the surface of this picturesque suburb lurked a story of betrayal and tragedy that would forever stain its tranquil image. The heart of this story lay in the lives of David and Emily Pearson. David was a successful financial consultant, known for his sharp mind and dedication to his family. He had built a comfortable life for Emily and their 2 children, complete with a beautiful house and all the trappings of suburban success. Emily, a former marketing executive turned stay-at-home mum, was the epitome of the perfect wife and mother. At least, that's what everyone believed. But the truth was far more complicated. After 15 years of marriage, the couple's relationship had grown stagnant. David, often consumed by his work, was increasingly absent, leaving Emily to manage the household and their children alone. The spark that had once defined their relationship had dimmed, and Emily felt trapped in a life that no longer excited her. She was longing for something more, something that would make her feel alive again. Enter Jake. Jake Stevens was a charismatic, handsome personal trainer who had recently opened a fitness studio in town. With his sculpted physique and easy charm, he quickly became the talk of Maplewood. It wasn't long before Emily, feeling neglected and craving attention, signed up for personal training sessions with him. What started as a quest for fitness soon turned into something much more. Jake was everything David wasn't: attentive, passionate, and spontaneous. Their sessions grew increasingly flirtatious, and Emily found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't felt in years. Jake, sensing her vulnerability, played into her desires. He knew she was married, but he didn't care. For him, it was just another conquest. One evening, after a particularly intense training session, Emily lingered in the studio. The gym was empty, and the air between them crackled with tension. Jake moved closer, his voice low and seductive. "You know, Emily, you're more beautiful than you realize. David's a fool for not seeing that." Emily's heart raced. She knew she should leave, that what she was feeling was dangerous. But when Jake leaned in and kissed her, she didn't pull away. That night marked the beginning of a torrid affair that would soon spiral out of control. They met in secret, stealing moments whenever they could. Late-night rendezvous at the gym, passionate encounters in the back seat of Jake's car, and stolen kisses in the shadows of quiet parking lots. The thrill of the affair consumed Emily, filling the emptiness she had felt for so long. She knew it was wrong, but the excitement was addictive. Jake was a drug she couldn't quit. However, it wasn't long before their affair began to unravel. David, though often busy, wasn't blind. He noticed the changes in his wife, her sudden interest in fitness, the late nights, the furtive glances at her phone. He tried to brush it off, chalking it up to midlife restlessness, but his suspicions grew with each passing day. Then one day, while rummaging through the closet, David stumbled upon a crumpled piece of paper. It was a receipt for an expensive hotel room booked in the middle of the day. His heart sank as he realized the date coincided with one of Emily's personal training sessions. The evidence was undeniable. Confrontation seemed inevitable, but David wasn't ready to face the truth. Instead, he hired a private investigator to confirm his suspicions. The reports that followed shattered him. Photos of Emily and Jake, their bodies entwined, their faces flushed with passion, were more than he could bear. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and furious. David's mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? How could Emily do this to their family? And most importantly, what was he going to do about it? Consumed by anger and a sense of betrayal, David decided he needed to confront Jake. But this wasn't just about a confrontation. It was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his family. He could feel his rage building, a storm that was ready to unleash its fury. He knew where Jake would be that evening, and he knew exactly what he had to do. As David drove towards the gym, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, he envisioned the encounter. He wanted answers, closure, but most of all, he wanted revenge. Little did he know the events of that night would set in motion a tragic chain of events that no one could have anticipated. David's heart pounded as he parked his car in the dimly lit lot behind Jake's fitness studio. The gym was closed, the lights inside casting eerie shadows against the windows. He stepped out of the car, his mind swirling with anger and betrayal. In his hand, he gripped a metal wrench he had grabbed from his garage, a makeshift weapon that felt heavy and reassuring. He hadn't planned it this way. Confronting Jake was supposed to be a chance to vent his fury, maybe even scare him away from Emily. But now, standing in the cold night air, he could feel his anger hardening into something darker. He wasn't just going to confront Jake, he was going to make him pay. David slipped through the back entrance of the studio, which he knew would be unlocked. Jake's voice echoed through the empty gym, speaking on the phone. David crept closer, his footsteps silent on the rubber flooring. He could hear Jake laughing, talking about plans for the weekend. Plans that probably included his wife. The thought sent a fresh wave of rage coursing through him. He turned the corner and saw Jake sitting on a bench, oblivious to his presence. David's vision tunneled, his focus narrowing to the man in front of him. Jake ended his call and stood up, stretching his arms lazily. He turned around and their eyes met. For a split second, neither of them moved. Jake's face twisted from confusion to shock as he recognized David. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice tense. David didn't answer. He just raised the wrench, his grip tightening around the cool metal. Jake's eyes widened in fear, and he stumbled back, raising his hands in defense. "Hey, wait, let's talk about this," he pleaded, his voice shaking. But David was beyond reason. He swung the wrench with all his strength, the impact reverberating up his arm as it connected with Jake's shoulder. Jake cried out in pain and tried to run, but David was on him in an instant, adrenaline surging through his veins. He swung again, this time hitting Jake, sending him crashing to the floor. Jake scrambled backwards, his hands raised in a desperate attempt to protect himself. "David, please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Shut up!" David roared, his voice breaking with emotion. "You ruined my family. You took everything from me." He brought the wrench down again, this time hitting Jake squarely on the side of the head. The sound of bone cracking echoed through the empty gym, followed by a sickening thud as Jake's head hit the floor. Blood pooled around his body, spreading slowly across the polished surface. David stood over him, panting, his chest heaving with exertion. Jake's body twitched, a low moan escaping his lips. The sight of him, broken and bleeding, didn't bring David the satisfaction he had imagined. Instead, he felt a hollow emptiness settling in his gut. Jake tried to speak, his voice a gurgling whisper. "Please, don't." But David's rage had not yet burned out. He raised the wrench again, his hand trembling. With a final guttural yell, he brought it down one last time. The wrench struck Jake's skull with a sickening crunch, and he went still, his body slumping lifelessly to the floor. For a moment, there was silence. David stared at Jake's body, his mind struggling to process what he had done. The gym was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights. He dropped the wrench, clatter echoing through the empty space. His hands were slick with blood, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. Reality began to seep back in, the enormity of his actions crashing down on him. He had killed a man. The weight of that realization was suffocating. David stumbled back, his legs weak and unsteady. He had to get out of there to think. He looked around, panic setting in. He needed to get rid of the evidence, to cover his tracks. But how? His thoughts were jumbled, his mind racing in 1,000 different directions. Then he saw the security cameras. They were mounted high on the walls, their red lights blinking ominously. A cold dread settled in his stomach. Had they captured everything? He had to assume they had. He needed to act fast. He grabbed the wrench and ran to the back office where the security system was located. His hands shook as he fumbled with the equipment, frantically pulling out wires and smashing the hard drive with the blood-stained wrench. He couldn't think straight, his actions clumsy and erratic. When he was done, he stumbled back into the gym, his eyes darting to Jake's body. He needed to get rid of it, but how? His thoughts were a blur, his mind clouded with fear and adrenaline. Then, the sound of a car door slamming outside jolted him back to reality. Someone was coming. Panic gripped him as he realized he was out of time. He had to leave now. He sprinted to the back door, his heart hammering in his chest. As he reached for the handle, he took one last look at Jake's lifeless form, a wave of nausea washing over him. Then, without another thought, he pushed the door open and fled into the night. David ran through the dark alleyways behind the gym, his breath ragged and shallow. His hands were trembling, sticky with Jake's blood. He had no idea where he was going. All he knew was that he had to get away. But as he rounded the corner, he collided with a figure, almost knocking them over. "Whoa, watch it," the man grunted, grabbing David's arm to steady himself. It was Greg, one of Jake's regular clients. His eyes narrowed as he noticed David's disheveled state. "David, what are you doing here?" David's mind raced. He needed to think fast. I was just leaving. Jake and we had an argument. I'm leaving." Greg's eyes flickered with suspicion. "An argument? You look like you've been in a fight." Before David could respond, the gym door burst open, and 2 more people stepped out. It was Emily and a friend from the neighborhood, their faces pale with shock. Emily's eyes widened when she saw David, and then she looked down at his bloodied hands. She gasped, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. "David, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice breaking. David could feel the walls closing in on him. He glanced back at the gym entrance, where the faintest shadow of Jake's lifeless body was visible through the glass door. Panic surged through him as he realized there was no way out. The truth was written all over him. There was no hiding what he had done. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Someone had called the police. It was over. I didn't mean to," David stammered, his voice choked with desperation. "He ruined everything, Emily. He took you away from me." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand, David. It was a mistake. I was going to end it. I never wanted this." The anguish in her voice cut through David like a knife. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of rage and sorrow. "You chose him over us," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You made me do this." The flashing lights of police cars filled the street, their harsh glow illuminating the scene like a grotesque spotlight. Officers poured out, guns drawn, their voices commanding and urgent. "Get on the ground, hands where we can see them." David froze, his mind numb with shock. He felt Emily's eyes on him, filled with a mixture of fear and pity. Slowly, he dropped to his knees, his hands raised in surrender. The officers moved in, their voices blending into a dull roar as they shouted orders and restrained him. As he was cuffed and hauled to his feet, David's gaze locked onto Emily's one last time. Her face was with tears, her expression one of utter devastation. He wanted to say something, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say to make any of this right? He was led to the police car, his legs heavy as lead. The gravity of what he had done crashed down on him with brutal force. Jake was dead, and his life was over. He had destroyed everything in a blind fury, and now he would pay the price. The police car door slammed shut, and David's world shrank to the confines of the back seat. Through the window, he saw Emily standing on the sidewalk, her shoulders shaking with sobs as their neighbors gathered around, whispering and pointing. As the car pulled away, he felt a crushing sense of finality. There was no going back. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His life, once so controlled and orderly, had descended into chaos in a matter of hours. David stared blankly ahead as the car sped through the quiet streets of Maplewood. He had sought vengeance, but all he had found was ruin. His mind replayed the brutal moments in the gym, the impact of the wrench, the look of terror on Jake's face, the sickening crunch of bone. The images blurred together in a horrifying montage that he knew would haunt him for the rest of his life. The police car turned a corner, and Maplewood faded into the distance. The town would never be the same, neither would he. And as the reality of his actions settled over him, one thought echoed in his mind, chilling in its simplicity and finality. It was all over.